So I'm going to talk to you today in this session for an hour very quickly about credibility assessment. And I'm going to use the term credibility assessment and detecting deception interchangeably. But essentially I'm going to talk about deception and how we can maximise the chances that we can detect deception in real time. Okay, so the things I'm going to try and talk to you about today, albeit very briefly, the science behind credibility assessment. So what do we know and how do we know it? Then I'm going to give you a brief introduction to how people generally prepare to appear credible. So how do they prepare to tell a lie? And then I'm going to talk about the challenges that you all face on a day-to-day basis, which not many scientists talk about, and that's trying to make a credibility assessment in real time, in the here and the now, not with the benefit of hindsight, which is what a lot of people talk about when they talk about, oh yeah, well I would have known he was telling me lies because. Okay, so it's worth mentioning first of all about the science of credibility assessment. The literature on detecting deception is absolutely massive. And I mean, probably one of the most researched areas in psychological science, for obvious reasons, because I think the person that finds that silver bullet, well, A, they'll be very rich, B, they'll be very famous, and C, our world would be a very safe place. There are numerous theories, at least half a dozen that I can think of. There are tens of thousands of book chapters and scientific journal articles, and there are lots of myths and an awful lot of misunderstandings on detecting deception. I think probably the 3 points that I'd like to make to you on, I hope you go away with, is that most lies are caught out after the event. Okay, so normally we look back at how they've behaved, what they've said, and we've caught them afterwards. So real-time lie detection, it doesn't typically happen. Hindsight bias is probably the biggest problem we have, especially as professionals. I'm not a professional in your domain anymore, but I was in the past. And we've all sat round and chatted, and with the benefit of hindsight, yeah, we would have done things differently. Okay, so you've got to remember that when people say, oh yeah, I could have done that, or yeah, it was obvious. Actually, at the time, it wasn't obvious. Otherwise, we would have picked up on it. And the advice and the science for real-time credibility assessment is limited. Very limited. So bear in mind your job is very difficult. So I'm going to give you some examples, first of all, because I've got to try and keep you buoyant, because it's the afternoon. And you may or may not have seen this, but I hope... Have we got volume, Yeah, do you think? I've turned my computer up. Well, shall I just give it a go? No. Oops, sorry, not plugged in.
Lying is a natural human trait. You manipulate the way you want others to see you.
Right.
There are certain signs you can look for if you think someone...
Right, let me start this again. Okay. Thank you, Chris.
Lying is a natural human trait that lets you manipulate the way you want others to see you. There are certain signs you can look for if you think someone might be lying to you. Eye movement. When right-handed people are lying, they look up at the right. Left-handed people look up to the left. Other signs of lying are, if they don't blink, close their eyes very slowly, or contrastingly blink a lot, or break eye contact. Hiding body parts. They hide their mouth, eyes, or throat with their hands. Grooming. They may also adjust their hair or clothes. Hand movement. Anxiety can cause itching or chilliness in the face, causing a liar to bite or lick their lips, or play with their ears. Head movement. They move their head around quickly before they answer a question. Audible cues. They clear their throat or swallow before answering a question. And their vocal pitch rises.
Yeah. No.
Can you tell who's lying?
I'm guessing most of you will have heard some of those before. You may or may not think that they're useful. You will come across people that think they're very useful cues, behavioural cues to deception. You'll come across others that disagree with you. I'm not even going to bother to do this, guess who's lying or not, because the science tells us categorically that all of those suggestions are complete rubbish. Complete rubbish. Not only that, I'm hoping that you will have picked up on the fact that they contradict each other as well. So, apparently, looking to the right or looking to the left, blinking or not blinking, touching or not touching, and so I could go on. However, these videos, professionals, courses exist all over the world. People are become very rich as a result of them. So bearing in mind some of the things that they've said in this little video, I'm going to show you a few short clips and see what your thoughts are with regard to this. So remember what they've said, and you don't actually need to listen to this. Is it coming? Right. So what do we think? Liar or not a liar? Hands up who think he's a liar, looking at his body language. Telling the truth? Okay, so everybody here apart from Chris has kept the hand down. No one is excited by this notion of cues, behavioural cues. Right, okay. We'll talk about that as we go through. Here's another one. Have a little look, see at this one. I'm just going to get you to watch him for a minute or so. What do we think? Truth teller? Hands up, truth teller. Hands up, liar. A few more liars. Okay. Yep. Okay. Interesting, isn't it? This is called self-adapting, touching. We do look at this when we do credibility assessment. We've looked at it in a laboratory and in the real world. I could go on. This arm's folding. Okay. Truth teller he is, complete truth teller. The previous video was a liar, politician.
But then you account yourself.
Yeah. Well done. This young man is a truth teller, tells the truth completely. It's a 20-minute interview, research interview, tells the truth. This second one. And bearing in mind, people will tell you that behavioural cues to deception are fantastic. This one. Liar. Okay, 2 for liars. Truth teller. Yeah, difficult, isn't it? We're guessing, really, aren't we? Complete liar from the moment she opens her mouth, and she's in fact serving a very long prison sentence for kidnapping and extortion her own child. So these are the things that we have to grapple with, that we have to think about when we're trying to make real-time credibility assessments. It's difficult, especially when you just look at behaviour. So what I'm doing, rather than what I'm saying. So what does the science tell us, which is what we're here to talk about? Detecting deception, lie detection is extremely difficult. Probably that one of the most difficult things that we will do as human beings, as real-time interrogators. Sometimes it's absolutely impossible, and I think we have to accept that. Sometimes we can't tell when that person is telling us the truth or otherwise. Accuracy tends to be at about chance level. When you are just looking at behaviour in particular, you may as well guess. And I've put 2 stars here because if I have time at the end of this presentation, I'll expand a little bit on that in terms of discussing the scientific literature and where this chance comes from. People always overestimate their ability to detect deception. We think we're actually quite good at it, especially those that research in it or that professionally we spend our professional lives trying to detect when someone's telling us a lie. Typically, this is about chance hits. So sometimes we will be correct by chance and we tend to remember that correctness, and that propels us forward with a confidence actually which, shouldn't be there. Biases affect our performance, so we have things like truth bias and a lie bias. So most of the general public have a truth bias, and I'll expand on that a little bit more. And I would suggest that most of us in this room would have some sort of a lie bias because it's very contextual, so it depends on our experience. We know that, and I'll say it again, I'll keep saying it, there are no reliable cues to deception. Okay, there is no one thing that tells us that that person is lying. And the main reason is because when we lie, we all behave individually. So, Steve, I'm going to ask my colleague now. Yeah, you can stand or you can just talk or whatever. I'm going to pick this up. Oh, do you need a microphone? Yeah. So, Chris talked a lot about the type of questions we ask, and so I'm going to ask a nice open-ended question, so a tell, explain, describe, and I'm going to ask Steve a question. And what I'd like, Steve, is to you to tell me, in as much detail as you can, about your last holiday.
Oh, let's see, my last holiday, the last proper holiday or vacation was, I was actually, testing one. So, the last time, holiday. Just joking.
I don't know what works and what doesn't work.
The most important objective we're supposed to achieve today is for me to be entertained. So
Yeah.
anything else?
Yeah.
Yes, my last proper holiday or vacation was, probably 4 years ago. I was in Munich for business, and I was on my way to India. The India trip got canceled, and I suddenly had time on my hands, so I decided I was going to go to Austria. So I went online, got train tickets. I love the trains in Europe because you're always on time. I could sit there in the first class car for not much more, have my cup of tea served from my chair, and I went to Salzburg. But then it was during Oktoberfest, and so of course Munich was crazy, but so was Salzburg, and so I couldn't find a hotel. But I was told there was one up in the mountains. There was a Hilton property. I took that up there, and the first place said, we have rooms, but we're all sold out. But what we'll do is we'll make it up for you. We have a room for you at our sister property. And I thought, yeah, right. Well, the sister property turned out to be a 5-star resort on this lake. It was the most gorgeous scene. And so soon after checking in, I changed into my shorts, went down and went swimming out in the middle of this lake. And I almost drowned. I remember it so clearly because it was just one of those moments of absolute supreme bliss. I thought, I'm in this beautiful place unexpectedly, and I started laughing, kind of singing at the same time. I thought, I have this corpse with a big smile on his face. They think I'm doing something else.
Brilliant, thank you very much.
What do you think? I was thinking volleyball.
Perfect. Okay, so you've listened to what Steve's had to say, and now, Eric, I'm going to ask you the same question. Can you tell me about your last holiday, please?
I'm having to think. I guess it's been, so it would have been summer before last. My wife and I will sometimes take the summer, we'll drop off the kids. I have a small army of children, so we'll drop them off with my parents in Dallas. and then we'll go somewhere. And so summer before this last one, we went up to Boston and then up the Maine coast. So like lighthouses, so we were stopping along the way, taking pictures of lighthouses, got some refrigerator magnets. But I don't eat seafood, but we're in Maine. My wife loves seafood, so we would stop, and just everywhere we would go, we were eating at some kind of seafood restaurant, and she was loving it, and I'm just holding my nose and trying to suppress the gag reflex. Yeah, so we ended up, we went up far enough up Maine to where there's a national park there. Is it Acadia or Arcadia? I'm forgetting. But that was just beautiful, and the coast was just very rocky, very rugged up there, and just amazing.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Right, so who'd like to tell me, was Steve telling the truth?
Yes.
Hands up for telling the truth. Right, 2 people telling the truth, 4 people telling the truth, and those, who else, what's everybody else think? Liar?
Liar.
Right, hands up for liar. Okay, right. So, could someone volunteer why they think Steve was telling the truth? No, okay.
Not very detailed.
Sorry?
Not very detailed in his explanation, so not that.
He wasn't very detailed in his explanation of, you're drowning, you're going to be, I think, more dramatic and more detailed.
So you think he was telling the truth because of the detail?
He wasn't.
Oh, he wasn't. Right, sorry, I misunderstood you. Right. Anybody else pick up on something else? Anything else that made them think he was telling?
You could kind of tell he was making it up as he was going. You could kind of tell he was making it up as he was going. He was kind of thinking about it and then coming up with it. So that was kind of a cue, not being too honest.
Yeah, good.
So again, talking about the lie, I noticed when he was telling his story, the actions and the description didn't match the emotion of the events taking place. And so, talking about drowning, being out in the lake, but almost laughing because of the surreal experience.
Okay, perfect. Oh, sorry. Brilliant, thank you. So interesting. Now I'm going to ask some of the people that thought the opposite.
No, I thought he was lying.
Oh, right. Who thought he was telling the truth?
I think you need to call my mom. She's probably the only one who knows that.
Yeah? Anybody else? Who thought he was telling the truth? Was it just a guess? Okay. Well, Steve was in actual fact telling the complete truth. Complete truth. So, the problem you have here, and I'm going to pick up on a little bit of the things that Chris said earlier, is that Steve was having to think back to 4 years ago. That is hard work. That's why you got the umming and the ahhing. You've got what you call the response latency. So we asked the question, he thought about it for a bit, then he talked for a bit. This is me walking through the memory process. Then he stopped, then he's thought about what happened next, and then he's walked through to the next piece. So this is why it felt like he wasn't telling the truth. Telling the truth, complete truth. Because he was remembering. Who thought Eric was telling the truth? Okay, so 2 of you. Who thought he was lying? Okay, so there's a lot of you that weren't sure, or you're just not willing to commit yourself. They're not seeing you, it's the back of your head. Eric was telling the truth too. Okay, so this is the problem you have when you just are listening to something that somebody says, and they're remembering it, and you are also trying to make out the associated behaviour, and you are looking for cues. Okay, you're trying to make a decision. If I were to ask you that again at the end of these 2 sessions, I would like you to tell me in the same situation, you should be saying, I don't know whether he's telling the truth or not. Because you haven't got enough information to make that decision. I'm forcing you to make it so that you can see the problems. But actually, because you haven't been able to ask them any questions, and you don't have any information about them, you are on the back foot, as we say in our country. Okay, it's almost impossible for you to make a credibility assessment in that situation. So just remember that as we move through. What the science does tell us, and this is what we're going to pick up on, is that we can improve our detection of deception or our ability to make a credibility assessment if we do these things. Okay, so if we look first of all for objective indicators. So I'm going to be quite controversial and tell you to ignore behavioural clues. For you in your job, they are not useful and they will lead you to make errors. Okay. What you need to do is you need to look for and actively seek objective indicators, right? And that can include, for example, using information that you know about somebody and using that tactically. Okay, so when you ask questions, you could ask, for example, a question of somebody about a piece of information that you already know, and according to the way in which they answer will give you some sort of indication whether they're telling you the truth or not. When you give yourself thinking time, so listen to what that person has said, think about what that person is saying, give yourself some cognitive space, as we call it, because it's very, very difficult. When the person that you're asking questions of, when they haven't had chance to prepare, so when their response is spontaneous, so when you ask them, for example, an unexpected question, a question which they're unlikely to have been able to prepare for, and I'll move on to that a little bit as we go. When the stakes for the sender of the message are high, so in your situation, when you speak to someone and you're trying to make a credibility assessment, typically the stakes, the end product is higher for them. They're either going to be believed or not believed, and that has ramifications. So that increases the chances that you can pick up when someone's being deceptive. When you introduce questions into your interrogation, and whether that's a very short interrogation, over 2 or 3 minutes, or whether that's over several hours, that have a temporal element. So Chris talked a little bit about this notion of asking people to remember things backwards. Well, if you can ask questions within your interaction that ask that person to talk about the future, and then your next question might ask them to talk about something they've done in the past, the people that are being deceptive, that is almost impossible. They will trip themselves up. Okay? When you, the receiver of the message, has some sort of control, truthful behaviour, and I'm going to use the word behaviour, but I actually mean verbalisation. So you've already got a gist of me at the moment, even though I've only been standing up here 20 minutes. I'm an illustrator. I do this when I'm telling the truth. And what will typically happen is if you start to make me lie, my physical behaviour will change, but only because you've made me verbally having to work very hard. So this is a natural behaviour for me that will change if I have to start telling lies. So all of these things together allow us to maximise the chances that we will pick up when someone is being deceptive. But you have to make these happen. They are not normal, they're not natural, and they won't just fall onto your plate. And this is where the science of interrogation or interviewing, we use the word in our country, but I'm trying to get to the interrogation. This is where it's quite useful because all of these suggestions have a good scientific basis. I hate this microphone, by the way. It's not right. So the one theory I'm going to talk to you about is this theory, which is very neat and very useful for your particular context, and it's called truth default theory. And this is useful because what it does is it allows us to understand why it is that we are open or vulnerable to deception. Because mostly when we work and talk to our friends, our colleagues, okay, leave aside your professional environment, but probably it happens more often than not in your professional environment, most people tell the truth. So it helps us in our everyday life to accept that what someone's saying to us actually is the truth, but it makes us vulnerable to deceptive messages. And we have to think about these 4 elements of the particular situation that we're in that will help us to move forward and make a good credibility assessment. So the 4 things I'm going to talk to you about are the context in which you are listening or having a conversation or interrogating someone, the coherence and the consistency of what they're saying, so what's coming out of their mouth, the diagnostic utility, such as the posh word of saying, how useful are the questions you're asking? Are they actually giving you diagnostic information that will allow you to make that decision? And I'm going to call you expert questioners because I'm going to guess that most of you question people every day of your life. So as an expert questioner, you can manage the way in which you question people. Okay, so these are the 4 things we're going to pick up from this theory. And, a theory is useful because it allows us, as Chris said, to drive the future research agenda. So context. So the context within which you do your questioning, your interrogation, your conversation, your interview, whatever you want to call it, and an interview or an interrogation is whenever you start to ask people for information, you've got to be aware of the context within which you are asking the questions, because context is everything. Okay? You have to be able to listen in that context, and you have to be what we call the silent questioner, and I think my colleagues have all talked about that. The least you say, the less you say, the much better, because you give yourself a chance to listen, and you're able to think about what that person is telling you. Now, you are experts in your particular context, and I know we have people from lots of different contexts. So, for example, I'm going to talk a lot today about interviews in portal situations. So where you've only got 2 or 3 minutes, where you may not have ever seen that, typically you won't have seen that person before. You may or may not have some information about them, but typically you don't. You might have passport information, you might have travel information, but that information will have been previously checked before they get to you in your portal situation. And so that's not that useful for questioning. And it's about how do you manage the process of talking to that person for 3 or 4 minutes in order to make some sort of a credibility assessment in real time. So you are experts in your particular context, and so that means you have a lot of experience about what normally happens in your context. So you'll have experience of, we call it a continuum. So you'll have someone like Steve, who provided, I thought, quite a detailed account of his last holiday, and then Eric provided an account of his last holiday, but it was less detailed. We had what we call gist information, so we had pockets of information about what he did, but not much detail within those pockets. So I know that in the particular context, this context, because it's false context, I've got a range of behaviours, and you will have exactly the same in your situation. So you know what normally happens in your interview context, and you have to be aware of this situation in order to help you to make a judgment. Okay, context is all. I've got a little clip here, which... Now, I'm going to play you various clips which have been collected as part of a large research project funded by the US-UK government. And so these are data or interview or interrogation clips, or whatever you want to call them, collected in real time in a real aviation security setting. So you're going to have to listen because we've got background noise. They're collected covertly, but what it does is it gives you a real example of the sort of behaviour that we see in an aviation security context when you're going through either you're trying to get into the country or you're trying to leave the country and fly into the US. So, this is an example. No? I did say there was a caveat I've got. Right. End show. Is it me? Right.
Good morning, you alright?
Listen,
Thank you very much. Foggy. Very foggy out there. Thank you.
you here?
There you are, Chief. It's a British one. Not a very flattering photograph, is it? He's renewing this next year. At my age. No, you're right. Come on, boys, give me a bloody honest answer. You're right, sir. You're okay. You're okay. You look very young, sir. You look very young. Just tell me what you do for a living. I'm now a debt collector. You're a debt collector. Yeah, but don't look at it as I'm a goody box. I'm not a goody box. Okay. I do most of the debt collecting done on the phone. Really? Oh, on the phone? I don't know. It's all my passport. What tactic? This one over as well? Of course I can. This one. Well, I'm nearly there. I said debt collector. Yes. What is your strategy? I'm going to America to see my granddaughter, by the way. This is quite good, this. Go on. What is it? Security testing? Oh, is it? Oh, I never know this, because I've never been to America before. It's a government fine. Okay. That's fine. I was going to ask you why you're suddenly giving me questions. When you go to Morocco or Spain, you don't get this, but go on. Yeah, it's just for your safety. Okay? That's fine, I like that. So, what strategies do you use to debt collecting? On the phone? Right, mostly, because I'm an ex-police officer, right, I've put something back in the community, so I do debt collecting, I collect consumer debts, i.e. big companies who owe money to the small shops, basically, so you just ring on the phone. So you try and do your to the managing directors. Well, it's not enough to go to America, Chief, but if you really want to know, you just ask them and sort of say, look, you owe, say, Mr. ABC, a small shop, Asian shop owner, 500 pounds, or 1,000 pounds, the normal is 500 pounds to 1,000 pounds. And you say, we need to collect this, they're suing you for the £500, rather than us going through the civil claims court, which costs you £500. Would you willing to do?
I'm going to stop there because it goes on rather. This is a gentleman trying to board an American carrier, leaving the UK and travelling to the US. So he's undergoing a layer of security that's in place, put in place by your government. So think about the context. Does anybody involved in TSA type interviews such as this? Okay, so it's a bit wasted on you, the context. So I don't know does anybody notice something odd about this person?
He's really brusque.
You have to shout or I'll have to bring this
He's
over.
very brusque.
Yeah, he's very
Like, for
brisk.
someone who wants to travel and go somewhere, he's not at all accommodating. And in the context of the interviewing I do, people want, when you have what they want, they tend to be accommodating even if they're in a bad mood.
And he's not accommodating. Okay.
And I couldn't tell, was he at the beginning volunteering more information than what was asked?
Spot on. Right. In context, that is a very, very unusual passenger. I've done more of this screening than I'd like to care to tell you, and I'll tell you about that in the second section, because as is usual, I'm running out of time. And that is not typical, and you were right as well. He had an odd manner about him, and this is where context is important, because you know, and people say, oh, I get this gut reaction, I get this feeling. Well, actually, it's not a gut reaction, it's not a feeling, it's experience, it's expertise. Because without even asking that passenger a question, he is behaving in a way which is so far outside of my experience, and I've only done 3 years of this training, that straight away, he's volunteering information which I haven't asked for, and so the diagnostic utility of that information is ignore it. I don't want you to volunteer information. I want you to tell me what I ask you and no more. So this is what you've got to think about context, okay? And I will go come back to that and move on to the diagnostic utility of the information, I'm going to tell you that information that's volunteered to you, that you haven't asked for, you should ignore. Because it's easily part of their life script. And again, I will talk to you about how people prepare for lies. Okay? It has to be sought, so you have to search for it, seek it, ask for it, and not offered. Okay? So I'm going to tell you to ignore offered information unless it forms part of an answer to your question. Unmanaged demeanour, so behaviour that has no diagnostic utility, is subjective and it's individual. And that means that you might as well guess. Okay, so you are looking for objective information that you have sought, not stuff that's been offered to you. Consistency and coherence. Okay, again, if you are trying to make a real-time judgment when you've only got 3 or 4 minutes and you may or may not have any concrete objective information about that person, then you've got to listen to the coherence of the story that they are telling you in response to your questions. If you've got some actual information that you can check the facts for, then that's all well and good. But typically in 3 or 4 minutes you don't have that. Okay, so you've got to ask the correct questions, you've got to think about the context within which you are asking, and you've got to listen to what people say. Okay, does this make sense? I'm going to suggest this is probably things that most of you do naturally. Some of you will, some of you won't, and the more experienced you become, the easier it becomes, but others of you may not think about it. And when you're trying to make a real-time judgment, this is what the sort of things you've got to do. But you've got to think about the context. So what's a normal behaviour for the particular context within which you are interrogating? Yeah. Finally, the questions. You've got to make people lie. Okay? If you let them sit in their lie script, the thing that they've practiced, then you will never catch them lying. It's too easy. Okay, so this is where your questioning comes in. Okay, you've got to think about the questions that you ask. What do I know about that person? So what can I ask them about to check that they are going to tell me the truth? Or what might I be able to find out if they commit to a version of the truth and they provide that information to me? Could I say, hold on a moment, I'm just going to go and do some checking. Could you go away, check that, come back and feel more confident in your credibility assessment. Expert questioning. So you will all be expert questioners in your own fields, but you need to think about the questions that you ask, the way in which you ask them, and my colleagues have talked about that, so I'm not going to reiterate them. You want to say as little as possible and get as much information as possible from the person that you are talking to, which is why, as Chris said, we want these tell, explain, describe questions, because you can't answer those with one word. And every question you ask needs to have some diagnostic utility. Right, so you're not there to just have a chit-chat and a conversation. Actually, you're working very hard cognitively. You're thinking very hard about the questions you're going to ask and the utility of those questions. And if those questions can be unexpected, then so be it, which is why we want to get people to step outside of their life script. This is the important thing. So, how do people appear to practice to appear credible? Okay, so you heard that last person. I'll tell you a bit more about him as we move through. Listen to this, because I'll pick this up, and then I'll tell you something else about him. Oh, hang on.
Well, you must go, but yeah, we'll be lost everything. No, I think you're right. I think you're right. Let's put something. No one's going to notice. Let's get back there. Well, yeah, thank you. We'll catch the sound. Okay. No one's going to notice it, tell you. Where's she going? Well, if you were walking down Coral to feed you in, I went into the. You go down. Is it downstairs? No. You just go around the corner and then you look to your far right, and that is all the Delta desks. And then you move down the side of it, and you go right in the end. There's a barrier. there's, you know, these strip barrier things, and you go in the last hole, as it were.
Delta 633.
TL63 go to Boston, direct, leaves at 10:30.
What are the questions you're asking?
Well, he said, where am I going, why am I doing, what do I do for a living? Yeah, he said, you know, what was your specific role as a prison officer? What do I do in my spare time? I said, I like to be a kayak. So he said, what's a kayak? I said, shut.
Right, there it is. And you said you did that car. Turn it.
Right, was that, did you get that? So they are both, or were part of a study that we did for your government, working with my government, on aviation security. That's covert recording of our stewed passengers who had ESTAs, had tickets, and were trying to get through the security measures in place at London Heathrow Airport. At that time with a particular airline, but we did it a lot across a lot of American carriers. That's them talking. One of the gentlemen has already been through the process. And did you hear him say, or they asked me this, they asked me that, I told them I did this, I told them I did that, and then someone asked me what a kayak was, and I went, yeah? Did you hear that right at the end? That was the killer question, because he was in a live script, he practiced what he was going to say, and that screener asked him one question, which he should have known if he did kayaking as part of his everyday, of his sporting activity, which is what he'd said. He got caught, he did not get through the screening procedure, because he was asked that question which he hadn't been able to practice. So the live script is this nice green line here, and what you're trying to do with your questioning, by making it as unpredictable as possible, is to get people to step out of their live script, and that's when you will catch them. Not only will you catch them verbally, and I've got some examples in the next session, but you'll also, their verbal behaviour when they've been caught out and they can't answer the question will be accompanied by a significant change in physical behaviour. You can see it, but you have to have the two things together. You can't have one, you can't look at the physical behaviour without it being accompanied by a verbal trip-up, as we call it. So what you've got to bear in mind is, I talk about the time when I bought an extremely expensive pair of shoes in London, in Harrods, and I wanted to get them into my house without revealing to my husband the cost of the shoes. So, just, I mean...
And what did your husband do for a living?
Yeah, exactly. He caught me out. Yeah. My husband is he's now retired as a senior London police officer, and I thought all the way home, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? He's going to go mad if he knows I paid the equivalent of $700 or $800 for a pair of shoes. It's a girl thing. And I couldn't really be bothered to have the conversation, so I thought all the way home about what I was going to say. What was my story going to be? He called me out because he actually asked me, because I told him I paid cash for them, which cash point machine did I go to? Hadn't thought about it. And that was it, I had to come clean. So, this is the story. So this is what you are thinking. You are trying to be clever. Okay? You are trying to think about, if I were making up this lie, if I were going to give you, talk to you about some information that wasn't truthful, how would I try and work it out in my mind that I could tell you without getting caught? So that is the sort of thing that people do when they try to appear and practice being credible. So it's the questions that you ask, the context within which you ask them, and it's giving yourself time to think and listen to what they say. Now, I've said all this as if it's easy, and it isn't. Real-time assessment, is the most difficult thing you will ever have to do. Okay? Sometimes we'll get it wrong, sometimes we'll get it right, but you can maximise the chances that you'll get it right, by making sure that you're aware of the fact that lies are not transparent. They don't bite you. They don't jump out and bite you from a conversation. Context is really, really important. And for portals, for example, where you've only got 2 or 3 minutes, you're going to have to work really hard from the moment that you interact with that person. Okay? Bearing in mind all the things that my colleagues have said before. Pseudo-diagnosticity. This is another posh word for asking questions which are, the answers will be completely worthless. You've got to think about what you're asking and why you're asking it and how you're going to use that information. Don't forget that there's also a lot of biases involved in human decision making when it comes to asking questions. What we're trying to do is we're not trying to support what we already think is correct. What we're trying to do, actually, if we were perfect human beings, would be to try and disprove what we think is correct. So ask an alternative question. This all takes practice, training, practice, but it does come. And we just need to be aware of the truth and the lie biases, okay? Because most people tell the truth most of the time. And that means that we have to work quite hard to pick up on those people that are lying to us, because it's not a normal default position for us. The default position is that you're telling the truth. So we know, and certainly this is Chris's most recent paper, which I read, it's very, very long, but that professionals such as yourself improve significantly in your ability to detect deception when you look at the verbal content of what people say. When you think about the context you're in, is that person behaving in a manner which you're familiar with, albeit that people behave differently? Or is this so way off that straight away you're starting to think, this isn't intuition, this is your professional experience. Okay, that's telling you right from the offset, something's not right here. Okay, so when you train people to look at what's being said, and then also to notice the accompanying behaviour when you question them, and your questions are useful questions, so you say as little as possible, they say as much as possible, then the chances that you will catch people when they're lying are much improved, much improved.